Hello. 25 years ago on this very day, the very first episode of Power Rangers Time Force premiered on Fox Kids. The 9th overall season of Power Rangers presented a Ranger team from the year 3000, the future, chasing a mutant criminal who traveled back in time to 2001, the then present day, where they do the whole Ranger thing for about 40 episodes. There's more to the series than what I'm actually letting on here because it's actually one of the better written Power Rangers outings overall. Strong characters, generally good storytelling, flirting with more mature narratives without going past the boundaries of what was typically kids' fare at the time. Needless to say, it is generally considered a fan favorite, and justifiably so. And so to mark the 25th anniversary of this particular incarnation of Power Rangers, I opted for a compilation of the video reviews I did for the 3 Time Force video games released around that time by THQ. That would be Power Rangers Time Force for Game Boy Advance, reviewed in 2012, Power Rangers Time Force for PS1, reviewed in 2017, and finally Power Rangers Time Force for Game Boy Color, reviewed in 2023. Mind you, considering the general quality of the games themselves, it's not much of a celebration, but regardless, it is a time capsule of sorts. A way to compare and contrast the 3 completely different games, as well as seeing the overall passage of how these particular videos have evolved, or de-evolved as it were. It's a walk down memory lane that I would normally prefer to forget, but what can I say? I like sharing my misery with everyone else. So here are 3 vintage videos on the video game endeavors of Power Rangers Time Force. Enjoy. Or don't. Either way works for me.
Power Rangers Time Force, the video game for Game Boy Advance, is loosely based on the Power Rangers Time Force series, where you take control of the Time Force Rangers from the future to apprehend the criminal Rancic and his band of mutants. In fact, the game's introductory level, where you're controlling the Red Ranger from the future to a rated base, is actually a recreation of a scene of the Time Force premiere episode, right down to the point where Red Ranger is taken down by Rancic and you have to find a new one in the year 2001, which is where the majority of the Time Force show took place. Now, on principle, the game adopts the familiar Power Rangers formula that hasn't changed much over the franchise's existence. Bad guy monster terrorizes the city, Rangers fight the monster grows, and eventually dies in the prerequisite Megazord fight. Repeat the process for the next few levels, and that's your game. However, while the Time Force show was content in sticking around in 2001, which seldom, if any, time travel involved, the game deviates from the show's limited narrative and actually forces the Rangers to travel through different time periods and fight up Rancic's forces before they mess with the past. It's a basic bare-bones storyline with few cutscenes, but it's an idea that would have worked if the game was worth a damn, and unfortunately that's not necessarily the case. The majority of the game has you controlling your Time Force Ranger throughout these various maze-like levels, fighting off disguised Cyclobots and seeking out items and energy pickups that will restore your health or add additional weapons and abilities. You can swap between Rangers by pressing select and picking out Rangers, and the Rangers act as your lives count, so to speak, so whenever a Ranger is downed, you'll have to pick another until all your Rangers have been defeated and the game ends. But you can bring a Ranger back to life if you collect Chronomorphers, and if all your Rangers are still active, then collecting a Chronomorpher will essentially add an extra continue to your continue count. Each Time Force Ranger possesses varying stats such as stamina, speed, strength, and whatnot, but aside from these variables and the color of their suits, all of the Rangers play almost exactly the same way, with none of them possessing unique weapons or special attacks to distinguish the bunch. Say what you will about the old Mighty Morphin video games on the Super Nintendo and their steroid Ranger sprites, but at least those Rangers had unique weapons and attacks. You honestly cannot say the same thing about the Time Force Rangers in this game. Oh yeah, you could also access the Quantum Ranger for a limited amount of time per stage by collecting the Quantum Morpher, but he's no different than the others as far as the moveset goes. In fact, the only superiority he offers over the other Rangers are the maxed out stats, that's it really. There's nothing else to really distinguish the various Rangers, not even any of the little things. It's rather unfortunate really. Controls are more or less standard fare in Time Force. The B button punches, A button jumps, and the shoulder buttons are reserved for additional weapons such as Chrono Sabers and blasters once you acquire them. You can pull off some combos and stuff with these abilities, but ultimately you'll just stick with bashing the B button when it comes to defeating your enemies, since the difference is marginal at best. You do have additional abilities such as double jumping, dashing, air dashing, and charge moves that clear the screen of enemies. Not that it would matter in the long run because there's not much to the gameplay in general. Other than some platforming elements and navigating the maze-like layouts of the lackluster level design, you're mostly performing endless combos on generic-looking enemies that, while fit the timeline, eventually turn into cyclobots and more endless combos afterwards. Sometimes you're even avoiding the cyclobots altogether and just trying to jump around like an idiot on your way to the exit while avoiding traps and pitfalls of the level. It's all rather dull and monotonous, really. All the boss monsters fight pretty much the same way outside of a couple additional attacks here and there, so it's just a pointless endeavor throughout. Upon defeating the boss monster initially, he'll grow giant size and you'll now fight the same monster with your Megazord, in what is nothing more than a really rudimentary and bland one-on-one fighter that maintains the crummy gameplay of the Ranger levels. In some cases it's actually easier because all you really have to do is power up your energy meter to perform your Megazord's crappy finishing maneuver and watch the monster explode brilliantly. And by which I mean not brilliantly. Aside from the uninspired gameplay, Power Rangers Time Force doesn't look all that appealing either. It seems like they were going for a hybrid, cartoonish, photorealistic look to the in-game visuals. I don't know what you would call the art style actually, that's the best I could come up with. Or how about this, the end result is rather dreadful, let's go with that. The animation seems to be well done, if nothing else. The Rangers, monsters, and what have you seem to move about rather smoothly in terms of the animation, but it doesn't account for the fact that all of these elements are an eyesore, really. You can make up the Rangers, they look alright, even if it's the same Red Ranger sprite reused over and over. Certainly better than the steroid Rangers from the Super Nintendo days, but I digress. But the enemies are poorly conceived, they look pretty bad, especially the boss monsters, which seem to be original creations for the game, rather than monsters taken from the show, which probably would have been more preferable. Even Ranzik's in-game sprite looks like crap. In between levels, they have these intermission sequences featuring these awful stock cartoon imageries of the Time Force Rangers, or these poorly rendered CGI monster images. Considering the capabilities of the GBA, I figured they would at least use some stock photos of the series of the Rangers in their suits. You wouldn't even need to show the actors if you wanted to avoid that whole deal, but I guess this was easier, I suppose, using stock cartoons and whatnot. I don't know, it just feels like a really big letdown considering that the Sega Genesis iteration of the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers game had these really nice cutscenes that almost looked like they came from the show. But, I guess, oh well, I guess this could be another prime example of Genesis doing what Nintendo don't. Or something like that. Quite possibly the only real positive about Time Force is that they managed to capture a brief sample of the Time Force vocals, and it sounds about as good as it could get on the GBA, even if it doesn't blend with the MIDI interpretation, which isn't all that bad really. It's not a bad effort actually, but unfortunately the designers should have applied some more effort into the music, because the rest of the game's meager soundtrack is drab, uninspired, and just not all that fantastic. It sounds like a monkey banging on a keyboard after consuming several vodka gimlets, and this was the end result of its labor. It's pretty dismal really. Oh, and the sound effects are rather uninspired and not all that great. It feels really disheartening that the Game Boy Advance iteration of Power Rangers Time Force falls short of being an enjoyable Power Rangers experience on the go, because the older games from the franchise's glory years were actually enjoyable fare and they were pretty decently designed games for what it's worth. Years have passed since the Mighty Morphin age, and the franchise had somewhat evolved to the point where the storytelling in later incarnations would have offered enough material for a quality video game if anyone was smart enough to take advantage of it. But even with low expectations, and I mean really low expectations, Power Rangers Time Force is simply a miserable video game. If the monotonous gameplay and uninspired level design doesn't kill this game, the rather mundane audio and craptacular visuals most definitely will. For what it's worth, I like the overall time-traveling concept. It's a concept that, quite frankly, I wish was applied to the TV show the game was based on. But at the same time, I also wish there was a good video game worth playing based on that concept. And this game, Power Rangers Time Force for the Game Boy Advance, is clearly not it. Not by a long shot.
Power Rangers Time Force, released in 2001 for the PlayStation and based on that year's particular incarnation of Power Rangers, which quite a few fans hold in some high regard due to its more serious tone or something to that extent. There's also a Game Boy Advance game that was previously reviewed. Long story short, it's not very good. And also there was a Game Boy Color game that I've got lying around somewhere. One of these days we'll get around to that one, but for now, let's look at this PlayStation game. So this game has you taking control of the Time Force Rangers from the future to apprehend the criminal Rancic and his band of mutants who have escaped to this past to do evil stuff and stuff. However, unlike the series where they spend the better part of the series fighting in the present day with only fleeting moments of time travel, Time Force the video game actually has some time travel involved. So aside from Silver Hills in 2001, which serves as your tutorial level and potential extra lives farm, you'll also be venturing in the Old West, prehistoric times, Roman times, and even the future. Ooh, God, this looks dreadful. Right, so each level has you picking any of the core 5 Time Force Rangers at your disposal, and from there you navigate the level from point A to point B, whatever that entails. Some levels are somewhat of a straightforward affair, other levels have you collecting a number of key items to shut down some force field or open up a door. Some levels have you looking for switches and levers to operate doors or manipulate the level in some fashion, but at the end of the day, the overall objective remains the same. Make your way to the end of the level where you fight off the main boss, defeat him or her, and summon your Megazord, which comes in 3 varieties but otherwise play the same, to put him or her on ice once and for all. Pretty straightforward stuff all around. In addition to the standard go through the level and beat the boss to move on to the next level stuff, Time Force tosses in a couple additional bonus objectives. As you see above, you have a timer counting down. Good news, when the timer hits 0, the game doesn't end, it'll just continue counting in the negatives. However, if you manage to complete the level before the timer hits 0, then you'll get a nice little health extension which allows you to last a little longer in a level. Naturally, the best means of speeding through a level is avoiding all the needless combat and just make your runs while collecting hourglass icons to add time. I suppose one could complain about the speedrunning aspect making fighting enemies worthless, but believe me, unless it's a boss, fighting just about anyone in this game is pretty worthless, and you're just better off making a run for it without lifting a finger. Go pacifist ranger, if you will. Aside from that, each area has a timeline artifact that can be found and collected if you're so inclined. There's 1 artifact per level, and if you manage to collect all 7 artifacts, you'll unlock the Quantum Ranger, who naturally has the best stats in the game, and is only available when the whole game is already cleared and nothing else matters. So that's pretty much a waste of time, but hey, look on the bright side. You could pick him as a separate character, he's not just a power-up like in the GBA version. Unfortunately, there's no Q-Rex to play around with here, and par for the course, all 6 Rangers pretty much play the same way outside of some minor stat differences, which is negligible at best. Also, unlike the GBA version, you don't have any weapons on hands. No chrono blasters or vector weapons to be found here, just the moves you'll learn in the training missions. Did I mention the training missions? Yeah, let's touch on that briefly. In between time zones, you'll participate in training sessions that will enable and introduce some new ability to your arsenal, whether it be a ground pound or overhead stun ball or whatever the case may be. These abilities can be used to either uncover new areas or get an upper hand against enemies, provided you have enough energy to pull it off. Energy can be restored by standing on these platforms, with silvery blue platforms allowing for infinite regenerations, while red platforms only providing a minor energy boost before being rendered useless. The problem with these abilities is that if you go back to an earlier level because you want to try and clear the stage quicker or find the artifact for that level, the more advanced moves won't carry over to the older levels and you're basically reset to your underdeveloped moveset as if you were playing that level for the first time. Just to give you a quick example, at a later point in the game you'll gain an arcing fireball attack that allows you to damage enemies at a distance. However, if you enter an earlier level such as the Old West level, you won't have that fireball ability, only the ground pound attack that you've learned after beating the first level in Silver Hills. It's too bad though, because some of the more advanced moves like the tornado spin could be useful in earlier levels, and it certainly wouldn't have hurt to design these levels in a way that you could only reach a certain point with a more advanced ability, but sadly, it's not to be. Of course, that sort of forward thinking would have been something you'd find in something resembling a good game, but not Time Force, oh noes. Despite its somewhat meaty potential, the game is hampered by gameplay that is snore-inducing at best, irritable at worst, and quite frankly, not something that is in any way entertaining. Like I said, the fighting is not at all necessary. You could just run past the cyclobots and move along without consequence. Only the bosses are required fights. However, if you do manage to get into the fighting bits, you'll find that combat to be rather unsatisfying due to the lack of attacks, as well as the lack of any semblance of competent collision detection. Like I said, all the Rangers play the same way, so they have the same punch, kick, jump kick, and a couple combo moves, along with the special abilities you gain along the way. So while it might be fun to try out your favorite Power Rangers in some sad attempt to justify the game's replay value, there's really no point in doing so unless you want a different color suit and another actor telling you to be more careful whenever you run into a hazard. Collision detection also pulls a hearty middle finger to the player when it comes to the game's ill-conceived platforming segments, which are bad enough on their own given the somewhat slippery nature of the controls, but magnified with occasions where you need precision platforming skills. Yeah, have fun with that. Running to fight another day might save you some headaches, but the sloppy platforming is what will kill you more often than not. And you only have a few lives and a few continues before the game ends, and your game save takes this information into account. Unfortunately, you could farm for more lives if you know how, but one wonders if it's really worth the effort. The Zord fights in Time Force aren't all that great, they're rather anemic actually, but at the very least, they're straightforward. It's just you and a monster in a circular arena beating the crap out of each other. No quick time events, no waving joysticks or other stupid gimmicks, just kill the monster and make use of your limited arsenal of attacks, which include 2 slow-moving projectiles. You can control the Time Force Megazord in either red or blue mode, but it depends on the level. You have no real choice over what Zord you get to play with. Later levels do put you in control of the erroneously named Time Shadow Zord. It's actually the Shadow Force Megazord, but I digress. But don't expect that to be some big deal, it plays the same as all the others. Power Rangers Time Force's main story, or campaign as the cool kids like to call it these days, is a strictly single-player affair. But there is a nifty battle mode where 2 players can duke it out. At first you only have the 3 Megazords to play with, but as you progress through the single-player game, you'll eventually unlock playable versions of the boss characters you've just defeated. It's something, I guess, but nothing that hasn't been done better on other games and on other platforms. Game Gear! The graphics in Time Force are alright at best, average fare at worst, teetering somewhere between the thin line of serviceable and less than stellar. You could recognize the Rangers and some of the villains, but the rest of the enemies are generally blurry, almost ugly looking critters. The level design and the set pieces are nothing to brag about, they look the part they're supposed to in the barest sense, but could have also benefited from some cleaner looking textures. Some mild clipping issues along with some awkward camera angles hinder the experience somewhat, but on a whole, it's a visually serviceable presentation if nothing else, nothing really offensive to be found here. At certain points the game will play stock video clips from the show. The clips aren't being shown here for obvious reasons, but I will say that while the video quality is good enough that you could tell what's going on for the most part, there's a good chance that you could get better video quality from old VHS recordings of Time Force from 15 years ago when they aired on Fox Kids. It's barely better quality video than what you'd get on the Power Rangers game that graced the Sega CD. Audio wise, meh. I guess I could give them credit for getting the actual Time Force cast to provide the voices, well most of them anyway. I have no clue who this Aaron Chill person is, but they say very little throughout this entire adventure. I mean, why even bother with them? Most of the dialogue comes from Circuit and some of the big bads like Ranzik or Frax. The performances are consistent with that of the show for whatever it's worth. Actually, they might sound a bit more wooden here, but sound effects are just kinda sorta there. And other than the Time Force theme that plays on the title screen and a couple other instances, your soundtrack comprises fairly paper-cutter orchestral themes that play during the levels. It does provide the game with something of an atmosphere of high adventure, and they're actually pretty decent compositions. If only the game was deserving of such pieces, which I am sad to say, they are not. Power Rangers Time Force on the Sony PlayStation is light years above the anemic dread that is Lightspeed Rescue on Nintendo 64. At the very least, the gameplay is straightforward, the presentation is somewhat competent, there are some side goals to accomplish if you're so inclined, the music's actually decent, and holy shit, you could actually jump. That having been said, do not take this to mean that Time Force is any good, because it really isn't. The combat is meaningless, the collision issues are distressing, the Zord fights, while somewhat playable, are not fantastic, the voice work is lacking, and the replay value is less than 0. Overall, Time Force on the PlayStation is not completely worthless, but outside of the devout Power Rangers enthusiast who has to have every Rangers game out there, this isn't worth the trouble of playing or tracking down. It's quite sad that when the best Power Rangers game to grace the Sony PlayStation that I've played is the Zeo pinball game, and that's not very encouraging. I'm not even sure I want to even touch the Lightspeed Rescue game now should I ever come across that, as both Time Force and Lightspeed on N64 have pretty much soured me on THQ's console games when it comes to the Power Rangers franchise. The pinball game's alright though, that's probably worth a look. Power Rangers Time Force, released in 2001 for the Game Boy Color, courtesy of THQ and Natsume, based on the then current 9th season of Power Rangers, involving a group of Rangers from the future going back in time to stop a fugitive from changing the future by conquering the past. And then they just fight in the same city for 40 plus episodes because Power Rangers is low budget schlock for kids of all ages and sizes. Sort of like how they had a season called Power Rangers in Space, but more than 2/3 of the show took place on Earth. Fortunately, the video games based on Time Force do more with the time travel aspect than the show does. Unfortunately, the video games based on Power Rangers Time Force have been of somewhat questionable quality, and I'm being generous in that regard. The PlayStation version is a thing that exists, while the Game Boy Advance version is a thing that I wish did not exist. But what about today's subject matter, this Game Boy Color version of Time Force? Well, if you've played the Lightspeed Rescue game that graced the handheld a year prior, then you got a heads up over the rest because the core gameplay is roughly the same. You pick a ranger, you go through levels, you fight a monster boss thing, and occasionally there's a Megazord fight every few levels. However, Lightspeed Rescue has additional levels involving the rescue of civilians. Time Force doesn't have that. Instead, you're given a blaster, a sword, and some special moves. Not sure how good of a trade-off that is, but I'll tell you this much. This is genuinely the best game based on Power Rangers Time Force. Not exactly a high bar when you consider the other two outings, but even a lesser version of the best Power Rangers outing on pre-advanced Game Boy is still better than the alternatives. But anyway, the format of Time Force is fairly straightforward. You pick a ranger, with each one acting as a life, so you're essentially given 5 lives per level, play through said level, and fight the end boss, which then has you attempting a quick time event to try and land the killing blow on the monster, or rather the blow that sends said monster back to the cryo freeze. Failure to do this and you have to keep fighting the boss and to try again with a quick time, and don't forget, you're under a time limit, and running out of time is an instant game over regardless of how many rangers you have left. If you manage to land the blow, you'll clear the level, but sometimes the mutant will grow, and that means a Megazord fight, of which you choose to play as the red Megazord or the blue Megazord, and if you're having trouble, your Zords will be upgraded to the Shadow Force variety, which aren't exactly helpful. We'll get back to this soon enough. As before, you begin each level with a full team of 5 rangers to choose from, and much like before, the differences between them are largely superficial stats and color differences. On the surface, at least. Dig a little deeper, and you'll find that each ranger has a somewhat unique arsenal of special attacks that can be performed by pressing a direction on the D-pad and either the A or B buttons at the exact same time. Pressing down and A will do a slide, for example. Forward and B will do some kind of rushing punch attack. Depends on the ranger. All of these cost energy to use, and the timing to pull these off is rather precise, but will prove to be much more useful than the stock punch attack, which is just as worthless as it was in the previous game. Each ranger also comes equipped with a Chrono Saber sword weapon and a Vortex blaster that you can select from your pause menu from the get-go, and these prove even more useful than your stock punch, but these also take up energy, which thankfully does regenerate, although there are pickups to speed up the process as well as restore a bit of health, add some much needed time to the clock, and there's even an item that lets you swap rangers on the field, which is sort of a nice reprieve if nothing else. You also have a rather nifty wall jump ability that seems a bit too eager to execute even when it's not ideal, but hey, an overzealous wall jump is better than no wall jump at all. Losing all health scrubs a ranger off the field, and losing all rangers ends the game. Running out of time will also end the game regardless of how many ranges you have left, so speed is of the utmost importance when it comes to clearing these levels. You do have unlimited continues, and there's also a password function to resume your progress at a later time, and that's about it really. Time Force is a fairly straightforward, no-frills, side-scrolling action game that does what it does competently enough. There is even the added benefit of featuring some major foes from the show, as well as some of the more original monsters of the week, which are slightly less lame than the jabronis featured in some other Time Force title on a Game Boy format. Some levels do have you seeking out switches to open up a path along the way, but the game's is otherwise no frills in the execution. It does what it does well enough, and that's about all you could ask for from a game like this, especially a Time Force game. Control sees a bit of improvement. Your ranger runs a bit faster, and your jumps are much cleaner in feel and execution. None of those awkward leaps that don't work as they should every so often. The wall jump probably works better than it should, but again, that's a good thing. I only wish they had done a better job with the offense, particularly your default punches, which again are practically useless. Your Chrono Saber's a slight improvement with slightly more reach, but that uses up energy, as does your Vortex Blaster, which only gets enough because it's nice to have a gun in a game like this. As for the special moves, the timing to pull these off is somewhat precise, but if you manage to nail it, they can be useful. That's assuming you even remember they exist in the first place, which I generally don't. Which is why you don't see it all that often. Speaking of forgetting things, the Megazord fights. Much like in the previous game, these are simple one-on-one duels that, you trade blows with the monster, build up your power meter to eventually execute your super attacks, and block the enemy blows and try not to get hit because you'll lose power that way. Unlike the previous game, which gave you a couple of tries to beat the monster, you only get one life to beat your foe here before you're hit with a game over. Multiple failures will eventually upgrade your Megazords with the Shadow Force, which gives you another set of Zords to play with technically, but I'm more than willing to give this the benefit of a doubt because at the very least you control a Megazord, you could have a fight with the monster, unlike some later portable entries which really don't do that, but I digress. Time Force sports similar graphics to the previous game, but with some slight improvements. The Rangers are practically indistinct from each other save for their colors, but the monster sprites are actually very well defined and quite varied as well, which is one thing this game has over the Lightspeed game. The levels you traverse through look nice and colorful, and the cutscenes are actually pretty well rendered, a slight improvement over the previous game in this regard. Time Force also has a killer set of tunes, including a pretty respectable interpretation of the Time Force theme, which is a step above the Lightspeed game at least, which didn't have their theme. But of course, it's Natsume. They usually have talented people behind the chip music in their games, and this is no exception. Sound effects are alright though, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing special, nothing offensive, they're just fine. Overall, Power Rangers Time Force is a more than serviceable little game on the Game Boy Color, and for what it's worth is a far superior portable outing compared to the Game Boy Advance version, which is just a terrible, terrible, terrible video game. This is, of course, basically a stripped-down version of the previous Lightspeed Rescue game, which at least had a little more meat and variety that this entry lacks, and thus that would be the game I'd steer you towards if you had to pick and choose between the two. But Time Force on GBC ain't too bad either. It's not much, but it gets the job done, and that's more than good enough for me.